The customs officer was certain the black traveler was hiding something and ordered a full search of his luggage. But when she found the federal judicial credentials inside his briefcase, she realized she had just violated the constitutional rights of a man who interprets the Constitution for a living. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and a comment before we start to learn more about what happened. Judge Robert Mitchell adjusted his tie as he walked through the bustling corridors of John F. Kennedy International Airport, his leather briefcase in one hand and his carry-on luggage trailing behind him. At 52, he carried himself with the quiet dignity that came from 25 years on the federal bench, 15 of those as a circuit court judge for the Second Circuit. Robert had just returned from a week-long international judicial conference in Geneva, where he had represented the United States in discussions about international law and constitutional principles. The conference had been both intellectually stimulating and professionally rewarding, bringing together some of the world's most respected legal minds to address complex issues of global jurisprudence. The flight from Switzerland had been long but comfortable, and Robert was looking forward to returning home to his family in Connecticut. He had promised his wife he would be home in time for their daughter's piano recital that evening, and he intended to keep that promise despite the jet lag already beginning to settle in. As Robert approached the customs checkpoint, he mentally reviewed the contents of his luggage. He carried the usual items of international travel: clothing, toiletries, some gifts for his family, and his briefcase containing legal documents, conference materials, and his official judicial credentials. Everything was properly documented and well within customs regulations. Behind the customs inspection counter, Officer Patricia Johnson was midway through her 12-hour shift. At 34, she had been working for Customs and Border Protection for 8 years, and she prided herself on her ability to spot suspicious travelers. Johnson believed that successful customs enforcement required trusting your instincts about people, and she had developed what she considered a reliable sense for identifying potential problems. When Robert approached her station, Johnson immediately began her assessment. She noted his expensive suit, his leather briefcase, and his confident demeanor. But what caught her attention most was his race. In Johnson's experience, well-dressed black travelers often warranted additional scrutiny, particularly those returning from international destinations known for drug trafficking or money laundering. "Passport and customs declaration," Johnson requested, her tone already carrying a note of suspicion. Robert handed over his diplomatic passport and the completed customs form. Johnson examined both documents carefully, taking longer than necessary to review information that was clearly in order. "Purpose of your trip to Switzerland?" Johnson asked, though the information was clearly indicated on his customs declaration. "I was attending an international judicial conference in Geneva," Robert replied politely. "I represent the United States on several international legal committees." Johnson looked up from his passport with obvious skepticism. "You're a lawyer?" "I'm a federal judge," Robert corrected gently. "Circuit Court judge for the Second Circuit." Johnson's expression suggested she found this claim difficult to believe. "Federal judge? That's quite a prestigious position. What kind of law do you practice?" Robert noticed the officer's use of present tense, as if she hadn't heard or didn't believe his explanation about being a judge rather than a practicing attorney. "I don't practice law, Officer Johnson," he said, reading her name tag. "I preside over federal cases involving constitutional law, civil rights, and federal criminal matters." "Uh-huh," Johnson replied dismissively. "And what were you doing at this conference in Switzerland?" "Participating in discussions about international legal cooperation, constitutional interpretation, and judicial best practices," Robert answered patiently, though he was beginning to sense that this interaction was heading in an uncomfortable direction. Johnson handed back his passport, but continued to study him with obvious suspicion. I'm going to need to inspect your luggage. Please place your bags on the inspection table. Robert complied, placing his suitcase and briefcase on the metal table. Is there a specific concern, Officer Johnson? My declaration lists everything I'm bringing into the country. Routine inspection, Johnson replied curtly, though her tone suggested anything but routine. Open the suitcase first. Robert unzipped his luggage, revealing neatly packed clothing, gifts for his family, and conference materials. Johnson began examining each item with unusual thoroughness, shaking out clothing and examining pockets with the intensity of someone expecting to find contraband. "What's in the briefcase?" Johnson asked, pointing to the leather case. "Legal documents, conference proceedings, and my official credentials," Robert answered. "Open it." Robert unlocked his briefcase, revealing stacks of legal papers, his judicial robes, and a leather portfolio containing his official identification and credentials. Johnson immediately began examining the documents, holding papers up to the light as if checking for forgery. "These look like government documents," Johnson observed suspiciously. "How did you obtain these?" Robert felt his patience beginning to wear thin. "Officer Johnson, those are my official judicial documents. They were issued to me by the Administrative Office of the United States Courts when I was confirmed to the federal bench." Johnson picked up Robert's judicial credentials and examined them with obvious skepticism. "Says here you're a circuit court judge. That's a pretty important position. How do I know these aren't fake?" "Because I'm telling you they're authentic," Robert replied, his voice remaining calm despite his growing frustration. "You can verify my identity through official channels if you have concerns." "That's exactly what I'm going to do," Johnson said. "I need you to step aside while I run some additional checks." Robert found himself being directed to a secondary inspection area, where he was asked to sit while Johnson made several phone calls. Other travelers moved through the customs checkpoint without incident, but Robert remained detained while the officer attempted to verify his identity. After 20 minutes, Johnson returned to where Robert was waiting. "I've made some calls, but I haven't been able to confirm your story. Federal judges don't usually travel alone to international conferences." Robert looked at her incredulously. "Officer Johnson, federal judges travel internationally all the time for conferences, educational programs, and official business. We're not confined to courthouses." "Maybe some do," Johnson conceded, "but I need to be sure you are who you claim to be. I'm going to need to conduct a more thorough search of your belongings." Robert realized the situation was escalating beyond reasonable bounds. "Officer Johnson, I'd like to speak with your supervisor. This detention appears to be based on your personal skepticism rather than any legitimate customs concern." Johnson bristled at what she perceived as a challenge to her authority. "I am conducting a lawful customs inspection. Your cooperation is mandatory." "My cooperation has been complete," Robert replied firmly, "but your inspection has exceeded reasonable bounds and appears to be based on profiling rather than legitimate enforcement concerns." Johnson's face reddened. "Are you accusing me of racial profiling?" "I'm observing that your treatment of me differs significantly from your treatment of other travelers, and I'm asking to speak with your supervisor," Robert said calmly. "You'll speak with whoever I decide you need to speak with," Johnson snapped. "Right now, you're under customs detention, and you'll follow my instructions." At that moment, Robert's cell phone began ringing. Johnson immediately became more aggressive. "Turn off that phone. No phone calls during inspection." "Officer Johnson, that could be an emergency call from my family or my court," Robert said. "I don't care who it is. Turn off the phone now." Robert reluctantly ended the call and turned off his phone. Johnson continued her increasingly invasive search of his belongings, examining every document and questioning every item as if it were evidence of criminal activity. 30 minutes into the detention, a senior customs supervisor named David Rodriguez approached the inspection area. He had been monitoring the situation and had grown concerned about the length of the detention. "Officer Johnson, what's the nature of this inspection?" Rodriguez asked. "Suspicious traveler claiming to be a federal judge," Johnson explained. "His story doesn't check out, and his documents look questionable." Rodriguez glanced at Robert, then at the documents spread across the inspection table. His expression immediately changed as he recognized the official federal judicial credentials. "Officer Johnson, these are authentic federal court documents," Rodriguez said quietly. "This gentleman is indeed a federal judge." Johnson looked confused. "How can you tell?" Rodriguez picked up Robert's judicial commission and official identification. "Because I've seen these documents before in my 20 years with CBP. Judge Mitchell, I apologize for this extended detention. You're free to go." Robert stood up and began collecting his belongings. "Supervisor Rodriguez, I'd like to file a formal complaint about this interaction. Officer Johnson's conduct was inappropriate and appeared to be based on racial profiling." Rodriguez nodded grimly. "Of course, Your Honor. We take such allegations very seriously." Johnson finally realized the magnitude of her mistake. "Your Honor, I was just doing my job. I had to verify your identity." Robert looked at her directly. "Officer Johnson, verification of identity doesn't require invasive searches, extended detention, or treating a traveler like a criminal suspect. What you did was profile me based on my race, and then use your authority to harass me when I didn't fit your stereotypes." "That's not what happened," Johnson protested weakly. "Then explain to me why my treatment differed from every other traveler who passed through your checkpoint," Robert said. "Explain why you questioned the authenticity of my federal credentials. Explain why you found it so difficult to believe that a black man could hold federal judicial office." Johnson had no answer because there was no acceptable answer. Her actions had been based on bias, pure and simple. Rodriguez stepped in. "Judge Mitchell, Officer Johnson will be suspended pending a full investigation of this incident. We will also be implementing additional training to prevent similar occurrences." Robert nodded. "Supervisor Rodriguez, this isn't just about one officer's bias. This is about institutional culture that allows such bias to flourish. Customs and Border Protection has a responsibility to treat all American citizens with dignity and respect, regardless of their race or appearance." "You're absolutely right, Your Honor. This incident will be thoroughly reviewed at the highest levels." As Robert finally left the customs area, nearly 2 hours after his flight had landed, he reflected on the irony of the situation. He had spent the week in Geneva discussing international legal cooperation and constitutional principles, only to have his own constitutional rights violated by his own government upon his return home. The next morning, Robert's incident report landed on the desk of the CBP commissioner. Within a week, Officer Johnson was terminated for misconduct, and the entire JFK customs operation underwent mandatory bias training. Robert made it to his daughter's piano recital, though he arrived later than planned. As he listened to her play, he thought about the America he wanted her to inherit, one where a person's worth and credibility weren't determined by the color of their skin. 6 months later, Robert was invited to speak at the CBP Training Academy about constitutional rights and professional conduct. His message was simple. The oath to protect and serve applies to all Americans, and the uniform doesn't give anyone the right to substitute bias for professional judgment. Because justice isn't just about what happens in courtrooms. It's about how we treat each other in every interaction, especially when one person holds power over another.